We follow a single scientist on a late shift at a remote U.S. radio observatory, tasked with routine monitoring of interstellar object 3I' Atlas for the record. The night is quietly boring, humming servers, cold coffee, pale monitors. He's rational, meticulous, slightly tired. Tiny anomalies appear in the data, a clipped optical spike, a strange radio blip, then a short burst of pulses that look almost like a pattern. He double-checks hardware, assumes noise. A colleague joins. They verify it isn't an instrument failure. They start a longer imaging sequence, and at the very last moment, 3I' Atlas emits a sudden, impossible yellow flash in the stacked frames, and every system in the room dies at once. Blackout. After the blackout, backup power kicks in. Logs show every subsystem dropped at the exact microsecond of the yellow flash. They discover that even shielded instruments registered a sharp, clean transient, too coordinated to be random. Other observatories in the US and abroad send terse messages confirming similar glitches at the same time. The team replays raw data as audio and spectrograms, hearing two perfect digital knocks synced with the flash. Headquarters quietly steps in with encrypted channels, asking for raw streams and instructing silence. The scientists realize the event originated from 3I' Atlas, but still try to treat it as a natural phenomenon. A second yellow blink occurs, weaker but structured, and some subsystems flicker or reboot without command. Escalation and loss of control. The signal from 3I' Atlas becomes more frequent and structured, but still non-linguistic. Grouped pulses, timed spikes across radio bands, synchronized with faint optical flickers. The observatory's hardware starts behaving strangely under the load. Antennas slewing in unnaturally perfect coordination, receivers dropping into protective mode, servers rebooting in a rhythm that matches the incoming pattern. Other arrays report the same. Central control issues stricter, almost panicked instructions. Do not touch the configuration. Do not interrupt the stream. It feels as if the object is probing the systems, not as a mind, but as a signal pushing at every boundary. The part ends with a prolonged sequence of yellow flashes and radio pulses that drive the array to its mechanical limits before everything freezes in an impossibly stable state. The station locked open. With the array effectively held on 3I' Atlas, the signal shifts into a new regime. Ultra-stable baselines, spectra that look too flat to be natural, broadband energy that erases normal cosmic noise. Small but unnerving visual artifacts appear on security cameras pointed at the dishes, shimmering overexposed bands, blooming whites around the antennas whenever the object emits its yellow blink. Power management systems start switching to backup and back again in sync with the pattern, as if the station were being stress-tested. Other observatories confirm synchronized disturbances worldwide. The humans are reduced to observers of their own equipment, locked out of control. The part ends with a long, blinding yellow flash recorded in the optical instruments as 3I' Atlas appears to flare and then contract in a way that no known object should. Peak, silence, and aftertaste. In the final part, the signal enters its most extreme state, total spectral domination, then a sudden global collapse to absolute radio and optical silence. For a few terrifying seconds, every instrument reads nothing, as if the sky itself has been muted. Then, systems reboot on their own, one after another. Logs show one continuous event with no gaps, but the raw data stream is missing a thin slice exactly where the silence was. The scientists never see words, images, or clear messages, only this impossible pattern of blinks and pulses that forces human technology into a specific behavior and then lets go. In the aftermath, official reports frame it as a rare, intense solar cosmic interaction. The protagonist, reviewing a locally cached thumbnail the system shouldn't have saved, sees the final stacked frame of 3I' Atlas, a single yellow flash translated into pixels, perfectly circular, perfectly centered, surrounded by dead black. He understands that whatever happened was not a malfunction, and that next time, Earth's instruments may not be the only thing that blinks off. Now, Part 1, full story. For audio, in English, continuous text, no on-screen words from the signal, no fantasy, only physics, instruments, and that yellow blink. You're going to hear a story about a night when the sky turned against our machines. An interstellar object did something it was not supposed to do, and for a few seconds, the most sensitive instruments we have simply stopped. If you listen to this to the end, you won't look at a quiet blinking star the same way again. Because once you know that a point of light can reach into a shielded control room and make everything go dark at the same time, routine becomes a lot harder to believe in. They'll tell you it was a glitch, interference, software. They have to. But I saw the raw file of 3i' Atlas before everything went black. And I know exactly when the yellow started. They said we shouldn't be recording that late anyway. They said it was just for protocol. It was a Thursday night in New Mexico, the kind of dry, empty night that makes the high desert feel like the surface of the moon. Out at the High Desert Radio Observatory, the sky had already cooled into a deep, indifferent black, the kind that swallows the highway 20 miles before you get to the gate. Inside the array control room, the world was small and blue-green, carved out of darkness by a grid of monitors and the low, constant murmur of cooling fans. The only other sound was the occasional tick of the wall clock and the faint whine when the antenna drives corrected their position a fraction of a degree. Daniel Hayes sat alone at the main console, a mug of coffee gone cold at his elbow, the screen light flattening his face into pale angles. He'd been on nights for 3 months straight, covering the long baseline survey, logging data that, 99 times out of 100, no one ever looked at twice. Tonight's target list was as unromantic as a warehouse inventory. 2 pulsars, 1 quasar, an ultra-faint radio galaxy, and at the bottom, grayed out until midnight, a label 3i' Atlas. The third confirmed interstellar visitor, already catalogued, modeled, written up in polite, careful papers as a mildly interesting but not world-changing anomaly. It had passed perihelion months ago. By now it was outbound, fading, a courtesy target. We point at it because we can. Dan had joked earlier at change of shift and everyone had laughed in that low, tired late-night way. Now the others were home or asleep in the bunk rooms, and he was here, waiting for the scheduler to roll over, listening to the air conditioning breathe. The control room smelled of dust, solder, and burned coffee. A strip of LEDs over the west wall flickered with slow, reassuring regularity. Power good, network good, cryogenic stable. On the big wall monitor he had a multi-panel layout. Upper left, a live schematic of the antenna field, 30 white arcs showing where each dish was pointed. Upper right, real-time amplitude traces from the L-band receivers. Lower left, a status grid of recording nodes. Lower right, a blank optical preview window from the small piggyback scope that rode one of the center dishes. It wasn't a fancy camera, nothing like the big optical surveys, just enough to give them contextual images when they wanted them. At 23:57 Mountain Time, the 3i' Atlas block highlighted itself. The scheduler chimed once, a soft electronic ping that had become for Dan the sound of things not being his problem anymore. He stretched, cracked his neck, and clicked acquire. Outside, 20 miles of armored cable and fiber told 30 dishes to pivot. In the live schematic, the arcs swung in slow synchrony until they converged on a single tiny crosshair in the sky. The receivers spooled up, their gain levels edging upward to compensate for how faint the object was now. On the amplitude traces, the noise floor rose, a gentle fuzz of cosmic background, terrestrial interference filtered out by layers of careful software. Baseline looks clean, he murmured to nobody, fingers moving through the routine checks without thinking. Verify timecode sync, confirm calibrator scan had completed. Check that the optical piggyback was online, configured for a sequence of 25-second exposures that would later be stacked into something useful. 3i' Atlas was just above the northeastern horizon from their latitude, skimming through a sparse field of foreground stars. It was supposed to be boring. Logging the radio flux this late in its trajectory was like weighing the crumbs after a party. necessary for completeness, but not something anyone stayed up for. Dan rolled his chair closer, thumbed the focus knob on the nearest screen like a nervous habit, even though the image was digital. The optical preview came alive, a grainy patch of stars, hot pixels, a little smear where the previous field had drifted. The first exposure of the new sequence started without fanfare. Timestamp marched across the top of the frame. Somewhere out under the stars, a piece of something that had been born around another sun continued its long, indifferent fall outward, across the plane of the solar system, out toward the dark. Dan's eyes flicked to the incoming log. Guiding locked. Recording started. Levels nominal. He stifled a yawn and took a sip of cold coffee. Grimaced. Set the mug down. This was genuinely one of the dullest parts of his job. Watch the numbers.
Make them stay the same. He let his attention soften, scanning the traces the way a musician listens to a familiar piece, more attuned to the wrong notes than the right ones. The first exposure finished with a soft beep. The frame flashed for a moment in the preview window before the system cued it for stacking. Dim star field. A faint, barely perceptible smudge near the center where 3I ATLS should be. Nothing to write home about. He tapped a key, brought up the real-time FFT for one of the L-band channels, a compact little waterfall display that showed frequency versus time in green and blue. It was almost hypnotic, the slow, steady rain of cosmic noise. He checked the clock, 0004. Another exposure beeped, another frame snapped cast. Still nothing. It was the third frame that clipped. It was subtle. If he hadn't been in that half-meditative state, he might have missed it. A tiny red marker flared in the corner of the optical preview, an overexposure flag, and the frame that flickered across the screen was momentarily washed with a soft pale bloom right where the central smudge should have been. Then it was gone, replaced with the next integration in progress. "Huh," Dan said softly. He leaned in, rewound the last few seconds in the buffer, and stepped through the frames. Frame 002, normal. Frame 003, the stars were all there, unchanged, but at the predicted position of 3I ATLS, the stacked light curve had spiked just enough that the pipeline flagged it as near saturation. Not a big deal. Brightness variations happened, but this thing was supposed to be fading monotonically now, not flaring. He checked the exposure settings, same as before. Checked the seeing estimate. Stable. Wind? Calm. He frowned, called up the radiometric log in another window. The radio channels had seen a corresponding blip. A narrow, sharp uptick clustered around the center of their band, a single time bin that rose above the background like a needle. Not wideband RFI, not the slow breathing of a variable source, just a poke. Probably a cosmic ray, he told himself. A high-energy particle hitting the detector could do that in the optical. And in radio? Some weird correlation, maybe. A logging quirk. He set a marker, added a note. Transient spike during EXP 003, POS-CR. He didn't like coincidences, but he didn't like ghosts in the machine either, and the easiest ghost to blame was always a stray particle. The fourth frame completed. No clipping. The fifth. Clean. The waterfall went back to its lazy rain. The longer nothing happened, the more he relaxed, until the little knot between his shoulders started to loosen, and his attention drifted. He was halfway through composing a mental grocery list when the sixth frame oversaturated hard enough to make the entire preview flash. This time the overexposure flag didn't just blink, it held for 3 seconds, pulsing amber, And when he scrubbed back the stored image, it wasn't a soft bloom anymore. The central region, the spot where the dim gray smear of 3I ATLS had been, was a tight, circular blowout.
Not white exactly. The palette mapping in that preview was false color, but the region looked warmer, yellowish. No way, Dan whispered. The waterfall had jumped too. On the radio plot where the noise should have been a random mottled texture, there was a sudden vertical band of high intensity across a narrow frequency range, one time slice wide. It sat there in the buffer like a stroke of fluorescent paint, smooth and continuous from top to bottom. Too clean. He froze, hand hovering over the keyboard. Then training took over. Screenshot. Save buffer. Tag all the associated logs. Check the environmental monitors. No lightning, no local interference. The on-site spectrum monitors were quiet. In the distance, through the reinforced glass, he could just hear the faintest grind of the dishes correcting their positioning, mechanical and oblivious. He switched to the raw data view for the radio channel and told the system to replay the slice with the spike as audio, mapped into the human hearing range. It was a trick an engineer had shown him years ago. Sometimes your ears picked up patterns your eyes missed. The speakers gave him the usual soft hiss, a low ocean of static, and then for a fraction of a second there was something else. 3 sharp, equally spaced clicks. Not a screech, not a roar. Just 3 neat knocks, like someone tapping a pencil on a table in the next room. He frowned deeper. Random noise could make spikes, sure, but random noise didn't usually arrive as 3 evenly spaced taps that lined up with a saturating flash in the optical. Maya's not going to like this, he muttered. Maya Lopez was the instrumentation specialist on call. He hesitated, thumb over the intercom button. This was probably nothing. Probably. Another frame finished. He forced himself to study it carefully. No clipping. The smear of the interstellar visitor looked even fainter now, as if whatever had flared had retreated again. His finger hovered a moment longer, then he pressed the button. "Control to Lopez," he said. His voice sounded oddly loud in the quiet room. "Sorry to wake you. Can you come up to Maine?" The reply took a few seconds, a sleepy burr over the speaker. "Yeah, on my way. That thing again?" 3I/Atlas. It did something weird. Might be nothing. He released the button, sat back, watching the traces with unnaturally sharp attention. Between the next 2 frames, nothing happened at all, and he almost started to believe that it really was nothing, that fatigue and nerves had overreacted. Then, frame 009 blew out both the center of the image and his doubts. The preview flashed brighter than any of the others. The overexposure warning pulsed in a steady rhythm, and the radio waterfall didn't show a single slice spike this time. It showed a ladder. 4 consecutive high-intensity bands, each the same width, each separated by exactly the same time interval. His heart gave a tiny involuntary jump in his chest. He forced himself to count the spacing in his head. 1 and 2 and 3. He replayed the audio mapping. This time the static was interrupted by a short burst of equally spaced, perfectly even clicks, 4 in a row. Too regular to be comfortable. His rational mind kept pushing options at him. Local interference, malfunctioning ADC, timing bug. He clung to those possibilities like handholds on a cliff. Footsteps approached in the hallway, and then the control room door hissed open. Maya stepped in, dark hair pulled back in a messy knot, sweatshirt half-zipped, eyes already narrowing at the expression on his face. "You only page me with that tone when something's on fire," she said softly. "What did you break?" "I didn't break anything, I think. Just look." He gestured her over, rewound the buffer so she could see frames 003, 006, 009 in sequence. She folded her arms, watching the screen without speaking. Her gaze flicked from the optical preview to the radio waterfall, then to the accompanying logs. Exposure settings unchanged? Yeah. Seeing? Stable. Guiding?
locked solid, no drift. She leaned in, squinted at the color mapping of the saturated region. Why does it look warmer there? Palette thing, he said automatically, then shook his head. But it's always the same region, same position within a pixel. He played the audio. 3 clicks. 4 clicks. She didn't react for a long moment. The servers hummed, a fan spun up briefly somewhere overhead, then settled. Could be a cosmic ray shower hitting both systems, she said at last, but her tone lacked conviction. Or some stupid local RFI that got past the filters. Did you check the field monitor? Clean, he said. No spikes on the spectrum analyzer, and the timing, he gestured at the waterfall. Look at the spacing. That's not broadband garbage. Maya sighed through her nose, the sound halfway between annoyance and unease. She slipped into the adjacent chair, fingers already dancing over the keyboard. Okay, run a hardware self-test on the receiver chain. Full sweep. I'll check the camera pipeline. Maybe we've got some idiot buffer overflow. He initiated the test. On the big screen, the amplitude traces flattened and then scrolled through a series of scripted calibration patterns. Test tones, injected noise, nulls. The system reported pass in neat green letters for each stage. No anomalies, no dropped bits.
Maya drilled into the optical pipeline, scrutinizing logs, checking for mistagged frames, corrupted headers, anything that would turn the center of the image into a recurring, overexposed circle. Nothing. Everything was clean and boring and exactly as it should be. The only thing that wasn't was the sky. Run a fresh dark frame, she said quietly, just to be sure. He did. The optical system closed its shutter and took a calibration image with no incoming light. The preview showed a field of near black with the usual salt of hot pixels. No circles, no blooms, no yellow. Dan felt that small knot between his shoulder blades tighten again. So, the camera's fine, he said, and the receivers are fine. Maya glanced at the antenna schematic. And the pointing? We're locked on 3i ATLS. Hasn't drifted more than a fraction of an arcsecond. We're good. She hesitated, then said, Okay, then we watch. Another exposure completed. The frame was dim, clean, unremarkable. On the radio side, the waterfall showed nothing but the soft green rain of the universe, minding its own business. The next one the same. For a few minutes the control room felt absurdly normal. Screens glowed, fans hummed. Dan's heartbeat, slowly, eased down. Maybe it was just, he started. And then the world stepped slightly sideways. There was no sound to it, no flash in the room, no dramatic cinematic cue. Just on the screens, 3 things happened at once. The latest optical frame snapped into view, and the entire central region went hard saturated, a tight disk of false-colored light bright enough to drag the surrounding pixels up with it, an almost golden blot punched into the star field. On the waterfall, the entire visible band lit in a perfectly vertical column, a wall of uniform high intensity that lasted exactly as long as the exposure. And in his ears, through the speakers, the static cut out for a heartbeat and was replaced by a high, pure tone that made the tiny hairs along his arms stand up. Then everything in the control room died. Monitors went black in perfect synchrony, icons and plots and error messages cut off mid-frame. The humming fans spun down into a sudden unnatural silence. The strip of LEDs over the wall flickered once, twice, then went dark. Even the clock on the wall froze, its red digits stuck at 00:19:32. Dan's eyes, trying to adjust from screen glow to pitch black, saw the control room not as a place, but as a void for one thudding second. There was a soft, startled intake of breath from Maya in the darkness. Somewhere under their feet, relays clicked like distant stones. The only thing still working was the emergency exit sign above the door, its green light suddenly the brightest thing in the room. In that crushing quiet, with the desert pressing in from all sides and 30 enormous metal dishes outside, frozen in whatever position they'd held at the exact moment of the blink, Dan realized his own hands were shaking. He swallowed, feeling the dryness in his throat, and somewhere past the fear and training and adrenaline, a single cold thought surfaced. The only thing that had changed in the last second before the entire observatory went dark was that 3I ATLS had turned briefly, impossibly yellow. When the blackout hit, it wasn't loud or violent, just absolute, synchronized absence, the kind of silence that doesn't feel like sound has stopped, but like the world has been muted from the outside. And for a heartbeat, Dan wasn't sure if the ringing in his ears was leftover adrenaline or something the blink had pushed through the speakers. The emergency lights began to hum on low power, throwing a thin greenish glow across the consoles, revealing rows of dead monitors whose reflective screens showed only faint silhouettes of him and Maya, frozen in the moment, both staring as if waiting for the room to inhale again. And he noticed the strange detail that the nearest rack server was still ticking, barely audible, its internal relay clicking like a mechanical heartbeat that had been left behind when everything else died. Then the backup generators rolled in with a soft surge, the LEDs stuttered back to life, and one by one the monitors revived in a staggered wave of dim light, each boot screen carrying its own timestamp, and every single one displayed the exact same strange offset. The timeline had jumped backwards by several tenths of a second, a rollback inconsistent with any power failure he knew of, and before either of them could voice the obvious question, the main array interface came online with a flood of alerts cascading down the screen. Hundreds of subsystems tagging the identical microsecond as the shutdown point, the same moment the yellow bloom had filled the last recorded frame. Maya leaned close, squinting at the dense wall of errors, breathing faster than she wanted to show, while Dan checked the antenna field schematic, expecting chaos or random drift, but instead found the 30-dish array frozen in unnervingly perfect alignment, more precise than normal guiding could realistically hold during a power interruption, each dish angled exactly where it had been pointed during the blink, without even the small jitter that mechanical systems typically introduce under load. And as she watched the schematic refreshed, and all 30 icons flickered simultaneously, as if the system was trying to report something but couldn't decide what. The radio receivers rebooted, their baselines climbing from zero, but instead of the usual gentle fuzz of cosmic noise, they rose into a dense, unusually flat texture, as though the universe itself had gone strangely uniform in that direction. And Dan frowned, because he had seen dead channels, flooded channels, misconfigured channels, but he had never seen a live channel look that empty and that full at the same time. Then the waterfall display populated, and the breath left his chest. The new data began with a clean vertical wall, a remnant of the last spike before blackout, and immediately after it came a staggered series of narrower, uneven bursts, not rhythmic, but too patterned to be random. Faint horizontal structures forming across the frequency bands as if the incoming signal was struggling to regain shape or fighting through some choke point in their hardware. And Maya muttered, "No way, no way," under her breath, and pulled up the environmental logs, checking for lightning, seismic activity, anything. But everything was nominal and boring, except for the synchronized microsecond dropouts tied to the flash. She tapped commands into the console, forcing a deeper diagnostic on the receivers, and as soon as the scan began, the speakers emitted an uncomfortable low flutter, like an old drive spinning up under stress. Though the speakers themselves weren't failing, it was the mapped audio of the bandpass filter reacting to something beneath the noise floor, a tremor rather than a sound. And when the amplitude plot flickered, she froze, looked at Dan and whispered, "It's still there." And he knew she didn't mean the system. She meant 3I ATLS. He forced himself to initiate a fresh short exposure sequence from the piggyback optical scope, telling himself that the camera would fail, the feed would hang, the pipeline would glitch. But the camera accepted the command, the shutter indicator blinked, and the first frame came in darker than normal, grainy, underexposed, like the sensor was still recovering from whatever had hit it. The second frame was cleaner, but empty except for the star field. Then the third frame rolled through, and the central smear of the interstellar object looked subtly wrong, shifted, not in position, but in luminance profile, as if whatever had flared was now pulsing, very faintly, too faint to clip the image, but bright enough to distort the color-mapped pixel distribution, and the pipeline flagged it with a soft diagnostic warning he had never seen before. Center band variance out of expected range. He almost reached for the radio to call the night supervisor, but hesitated when the internal network flashed a new notification, an encrypted inbound connection from headquarters, an address he recognized only vaguely from old drills, but had never seen used in live operations. The window expanded on its own, black background, no headers, and a string of coordinates loaded automatically, updating every second, tracking the exact position of 3I ATLS with a precision that exceeded their own guiding tolerance. And beneath the coordinates, a single instruction repeated every few seconds in shifting timestamps. Stream raw data, now. No explanation, no context, no identifiers. Maya's face tightened, and she said in a very small voice, "They don't do real-time orders at night unless the signature matches an internal red alert." But Dan had already opened the pipeline to push the raw radio data through, watching the bitstream counter spike far higher than it should for such a narrow slice of sky.
As soon as the stream engaged, the receivers flickered, their baselines oscillating in a way that reminded him of feedback loops in audio systems, the silent equivalent of a microphone too close to a speaker. Except here, the equipment wasn't misconfigured, it was reacting. The waterfall gained density, bands sharpening, faint diagonal streaks emerging like interference fringes, as though the signal was scanning through frequencies, searching for stability. And Dan could feel the hair rising on his arms again, though he had no explanation for why a natural object would emit a structured broadband event like this on the heels of an optical flash. Maya reran the hardware self-test and watched in stunned silence as half the modules reported pass and half returned a strange latency mismatch, all identical, as if delayed by the same external input. When she tried to isolate one of the receivers for a single-channel scan, the command denied itself with a soft system chime he had never heard before, and he realized with a cold twist that they had been locked out of their own instruments. Everything was in remote override. He tried another console, then a third, and each one flickered and returned to the same guided interface, the identical layout forced across every display. Outside, through the narrow window, something moved, not light, but motion. Several dishes had pivoted in small, perfectly synchronized corrections, the kind of micro-adjustments guiding sometimes made, but never with all 30 dishes at once. And Maya turned sharply toward the sound as the drives hummed in harmony for a solid 3 seconds before stopping dead. Dan checked the external alignment logs and found timestamps that did not match any local control. Every adjustment tagged remote access with a cryptic node ID. He pulled up the monitoring feed from the primary dish camera, expecting static, but instead saw the array under faint moonlight, still and orderly until a soft shimmer bled across the lens, a band of overexposure like heat distortion rippling through the sensor. And for a moment, the image warped subtly, the horizon bending as though the optics were being strained or the feed was catching the after-image of the yellow flash. He blinked hard, replayed the buffer, but the artifact repeated, more mechanical than optical, too smooth for atmospheric distortion, too persistent to be compression.
The next waterfall slice came in heavier, more structured, with clusters of short-duration pulses chained together in patterns he could not classify, some rising in amplitude with each cycle, others collapsing into narrow peaks, the whole plot beginning to look like a machine struggling to tune itself. The amplitude trace rose until one of the receivers tripped its automatic protection threshold and shut itself down, throwing a loud relay click into the room. And Maya jumped, swore under her breath, then hurried to check the thermal readings. One of the boards was running far hotter than expected for this gain level, as if something was hammering the front end harder than the receivers were built to handle. The overhead lights dimmed for a moment, stabilizing on the backup generators, but the timing of the dimming was wrong, slightly delayed, and came in short, synchronized pulses that matched the higher amplitude burst intervals on the waterfall. Dan stood, pacing a tight arc behind his chair, forcing himself to breathe evenly, telling himself that all of this could still be interference, an atmospheric reflection, some cascading equipment failure. But the logic was collapsing under its own weight, because nothing local caused global override, nothing natural forced perfect antenna synchrony, and nothing he knew of pushed optical and radio instruments to fail in the same millisecond. Then, without warning, every channel on the waterfall shifted upward together, a narrow frequency drift so perfectly aligned across all receivers that it looked artificial, but couldn't be labeled as such because no artificial source could be coming from an outbound interstellar object this faint. The drift stabilized into an unearning equilibrium, the bands forming a clean, razor-straight plateau as though the signal had finally locked into whatever profile it had been chasing. The dishes moved again, all of them, a soft mechanical groan trembling through the floor as the array rotated in a single unified motion, more precise than any of their usual calibration routines, and for a few long seconds, the entire observatory felt as if it were no longer steering itself. Maya whispered something he didn't fully catch, something like, "This isn't guided." And then the last optical frame of the resumed sequence arrived, and the center of the image burned bright, not clipping, not blooming, but a tight, perfectly centered yellow point, far brighter than the object should have been at this distance, bright enough to bleed across channels that were supposedly isolated. And before either of them could speak, the waterfall responded with a tall, dense spike, impossibly clean, impossibly narrow, rising like a single precise blade in the plot. The fans surged, the drives clicked, the entire room hummed with a frequency he could almost feel more than hear. And as the spike reached peak amplitude, the waterfall froze mid-frame, every pixel locked in place like a snapshot of something about to release or collapse. The waterfall remained frozen, an entire block of the spectrum suspended like a sheet of glass, and for a long second, Dan felt the absurd fear that if he touched the keyboard, the image might shatter, because nothing in a live data stream should ever hold perfectly still, not even for an instant. And yet every pixel stayed pinned in that impossible formation, while the room hummed with a low mechanical tension, as though the hardware was bracing itself for something neither he nor Maya could name. Then the freeze released in a sharp, stuttering jitter, the waterfall snapping back into motion with a violent overshoot that made the band stretch and smear before settling into a new, harsher rhythm that felt less like noise and more like a machine revving itself. And the amplitude jumped high enough for the software to throw a dozen clipped intensity alerts that stacked in the corner of the screen, like a flashing warning that the receivers were entering unsafe territory, though the override locked them from reducing gain, and Dan swore under his breath as the thermal monitor spiked again, one of the L-band boards creeping dangerously close to its cutoff threshold. Outside, the dishes emitted a groaning metallic chorus as they slewed again in flawless synchrony, 30 massive steel structures pivoting towards a slightly adjusted celestial coordinate, with a unity that made Maya flinch, because under normal conditions, even the best-driven arrays never moved with that kind of absolute precision across mechanical tolerances and wind shear. But here they turned like a single organism responding to a stimulus none of them controlled. unrolled. And as they locked into the new angle, the receiver noise floor dropped sharply, not rising as expected with the new pointing direction, but collapsing into a strangely narrow corridor of intensity, as though 3i Atlas was filtering out the background by some interaction the equipment wasn't built to interpret. Dan opened a cross-station channel to check other observatories, and the window filled instantly with delayed packets from Australia, South Africa, and Chile, each one reporting variations of the same anomaly: unexpected power flickers, synchronized dish movements, stabilization drifts, and noise floor suppression occurring within seconds of their own targeted observations of the interstellar object, though they too insisted they had not initiated any such maneuvers. The Australian station sent a terse message, phase shift detected, followed by another seconds later, receivers in unknown mode, and the South African array contributed a log snippet that showed their entire dish network had rotated 2 degrees without command, the timestamp matching almost exactly the moment Dan's own array had frozen under the spike.
As these external confirmations streamed in, a burst of new alerts flooded the local network. Small black windows popping open on every console, with instructions from HQ growing shorter and more frantic. Continue raw stream, do not isolate channels, do not interrupt alignment. And the final line repeating over and over with slightly different timestamps, do not attempt local control, until the windows began to stack and flicker, overlapping so quickly that the screens looked like they were vibrating under the weight of the warning. Maya tried to clear one of the overlays, but the system slapped it back in place within a fraction of a second, blocking her input, and she stared at the blinking flood with her jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle in her cheek twitched. The baseline shifted again, a long, slow drift downward through the band, and then rose with sudden, startling uniformity, forming a plateau so clean that the software misinterpreted it as a hardware fault and attempted to auto-reset the front end, only to be denied by the override, trapping the receivers in the high-intensity state. The speakers crackled with mapped audio tremors that sounded like a low, rippling sweep, a sound with too much structure to be dismissed as static, but still far from anything that could be interpreted as communication. Just a mechanical resonance born from the conversion of a bandwidth the human ear was never meant to experience. And when the sweep peaked, it pushed a brief distortion across every display, a flicker that made the text smear to the right by a few pixels before snapping back, like a vertical sync tearing across old analog monitors. Dan felt sweat gather between his fingers and the edge of the console as he forced himself to run a diagnostic on the synchronization clocks, needing some anchor to the known world. But the result made his breath catch. The master clock had drifted by a full 3 microseconds relative to the atomic reference, a shift so violent and sudden it defied mechanical explanation. And even more unnerving was the fact that the drift occurred at the precise moment the yellow flare had hit all 3 continents simultaneously. Maya pulled up the optical buffer again, cueing the last few frames, and the images showed something new, something that made her blink twice and lean forward until her forehead nearly touched the glass. The central pixel cluster, representing 3i ATA, pulsed, faintly but regularly, a tiny rise and fall in brightness every few seconds, not enough to trigger saturation, but enough to show up in the pixel histogram as a breathing pattern. And she whispered, "That's not possible at this distance," before catching herself, as if afraid to give the thought shape. The waterfall responded to the next faint pulse with a jitter that sharpened into a cluster of microbursts, each one narrower than the last, stepping upward in frequency with unnatural precision, and the array's servo motors answered with a subtle synchronized twitch that traveled through the building like a small earthquake. Dan checked the movement logs, but there were no timestamps, no commands, just empty entries where adjustment lines should have been, a complete absence of human activity, documented as though the system refused to acknowledge its own motion. The backup power cycled again, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room climbed as the receiver board strained under sustained load, one of them emitting the faint smell of heated plastic that made Maya shove her chair backward and kneel beside the rack to check the airflow. But the pattern of heating didn't match a normal overload. It was pulsing with the same rhythm as the pixel histogram, rising sharply during each pulse from 3i ATA and dropping in between, a heat signature that felt reactive rather than spontaneous. Dan reopened the global channel and saw new messages stacking in frantic succession. The Chilean array reported telemetry drops, their alignment locked into a non-standard pointing mode. The Australian team logged a total freeze of their waterfall for 8 seconds before it resumed in a new frequency profile. The South Africans claimed their system attempted to dump a decade's worth of calibration tables before the command was overridden. And through all this chaos, HQ continued to issue terse, increasingly contradictory instructions: maintain stream, cease local diagnostics, initiate channel isolation, do not isolate channels. Until finally, the instructions devolved into blank packets, as though the controlling system upstream was losing coherence under its own storm of data. Maya tried to access a low-level terminal, hoping to bypass the interference and regain some semblance of control. But the console rejected every command with an identical error code, locked by remote. And she slammed her fist softly against the plastic edge, not from anger, but from a quiet, growing confusion that was starting to shake her professional composure. Then the waterfall bands began to compress, folding inward towards a central line with increasing speed, each iteration shaving off random noise, narrowing the spectrum until the entire band resembled a triangular funnel collapsing into a razor-thin frequency. And Dan felt his throat tighten because no natural source he'd ever studied behaved this way. No astrophysical emission abandoned its entire width of noise to settle into a perfect core with such mechanical inevitability. And yet here it was, shrinking, tightening, refining itself like a tool being honed. Outside, the dishes shuddered again, louder this time, metal groaning in the cold desert air as they pivoted in a fast, coordinated snap to a slightly different angle. And for a brief moment, the feeds from the external security cameras all glitched simultaneously, the image breaking into pixelated blocks, overexposed horizontal streaks, and lens-banding blooms that threw white scars across the screen. And Maya gasped as the sky above the array flickered with a faint, impossible shimmer, though she couldn't tell if it was a camera artifact or a real optical distortion. The array locked into its new orientation, and the waterfall abruptly stopped collapsing, resting at a single, impossibly thin line, a frequency so pure that even the software refused to categorize it, leaving the field blank as though unable to accept its own input. The line held steady, unwavering, flat as a cut through the universe, and the speakers translated the mapped audio into a thin, piercing tone so clean it felt less like sound and more like pressure, like something pressing against the bones of the skull. Dan reached out involuntarily as if to lower the gain, but his hand hovered uselessly over the controls because everything was locked, frozen, stripped of manual authority. And in the frozen moment that followed, the line in the waterfall brightened slightly, its color shifting towards a hotter intensity, not through saturation, but through a rendering mode he'd never seen the software use, as though the system was inventing a visual language to represent something outside its design. And then with a suddenness that made both of them jolt backward, every heavy instrument in the room activated simultaneously in a deafening harmonic surge, the room thrumming with synchronized mechanical vibration, as though the entire observatory had been grabbed and shaken into perfect alignment. And the last thing Dan saw before the screen brightness spiked was the razor line in the waterfall bending upward in a perfectly smooth arc, as if the signal had just shifted into a new mode they were never meant to handle. The harmonic surge rattled the room so violently that Dan instinctively grabbed the edge of the console, feeling the vibration travel through the metal frame into his wrists, as if the whole building was a single resonant cavity being forced to match the frequency pouring from 3i ATA. And for an instant, the screens ballooned into blinding sheets of white before collapsing back into the interface, now stripped down to bare telemetry, as though the software had abandoned every non-essential process just to survive the incoming load. The waterfall reappeared not as a clean plot, but as a chaotic smear of vertical streaks, each one flickering with microsecond instability, forming and collapsing so quickly that the buffer couldn't keep up. And the amplitude trace jittered in a way that resembled cardiac fibrillation, too fast to track, too noisy to classify. And yet woven through the chaos, there was a subtle, rhythmic tremor, faint but unmistakable, a hidden pulse buried beneath the overload. And Maya leaned close enough that her breath fogged the glass of the main display, whispering, "This isn't random," though neither of them dared to follow that thought. Then a deep groan rolled through the ceiling as the array outside jerked in another unified correction, far sharper and faster than any designed mechanical limit should allow. The motion so abrupt that equipment in the racks behind them rattled against their housings, and Dan instinctively checked the external camera feed, only to find the video smeared with blooming white stripes, the sensor overwhelmed by sudden lens banding artifacts whenever the dishes moved, as though the air itself was being torn into streaks of brightness the camera couldn't parse.
Through the distortion, he'd caught the silhouettes of the 30 massive dishes pivoting in near-perfect unison, their movements synchronized down to the sub-degree as if driven by one motor instead of 30. And that impossible unity sent a cold ripple down his spine because the override commands in the logs weren't tagged with any recognizable source, only blank entries, empty fields, timestamps, and nothing else, as if the system itself refused to identify the origin of the override. Then, as if responding to some invisible threshold, the chaos on the waterfall suddenly tightened into 3 broad pulses, evenly spaced, massive spikes that lit up the entire band with raw, biting intensity, each one lingering just long enough for the software to scream overload warnings before the next crashed in. And in the mapped audio, each pulse translated into a deep, metallic boom that reverberated through the room like distant thunder amplified through machinery. And with each boom, the lights overhead dimmed, fluttered, then steadied again, as though the observatory were inhaling and exhaling in sync with the pulses. Dan felt sweat gathering along his hairline despite the cold of the night, and he forced himself to look at the optical feed, which resumed just long enough to show a brief, trembling frame of 3i ATLS, surrounded by a pale yellow halo, an artifact, he told himself, a sensor error, a heat bloom. But even the artifact held a strange symmetry that made something deep in him recoil. And before he could zoom in, the optical sensor froze, pixel grid locking into a static image while the processing bar hung at 0%, as if the camera pipeline had simply refused to interpret what it captured. Then, the room jolted softly as the backup generator cycled again, but instead of the usual smooth power handoff, the transition stumbled, lights flickering in tight rhythmic bursts that matched the 3 massive spikes still echoing through the waterfall. And Maya shot up from her station, stepping back as if the console itself had become volatile, staring at the patterns jumping across the screen with wide, disbelieving eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped when a new window forced itself over every active screen. This one not from HQ, but from the local supervisory node, a system that was never supposed to issue global alerts unless in catastrophic failure. And though the alert carried no text, no instructions, only a blank black box with a blinking border, Dan felt an instinctive knot form in his stomach, because the blinking matched the 3-pulse rhythm on the waterfall exactly.
Then, the sound of shifting metal from outside made both of them whip their heads toward the window again, and through the glass they saw multiple dishes locking into a fixed, rigid orientation so precisely aligned that the silhouettes overlapped in geometric symmetry, something no mechanical tolerance should achieve. The array frozen like a single, monolithic instrument staring at a point on the horizon beyond anything marked on their star charts. Dan ran to the external map, loaded the new pointing coordinates, and felt his throat dry instantly, because the system was reporting the array was locked onto a coordinate that did not match the expected trajectory of 3I ATLS, but was instead offset by a narrow fractional angle, too deliberate to be drift, too sharp to be error. And the offset was changing every second, the coordinate drifting in a smooth, steady glide, as though tracking something dynamic, something moving, something the system believed was there even when the optical feed showed only the faint outline of the interstellar object. The global observatory channel chimed again, the packets coming in faster than the interface could stack them. Australia reporting an identical pointing lockout, Chile reporting unexplained servo load spikes, South Africa claiming their entire dish mesh had entered a stabilization mode they didn't even know existed, and all three stations reporting the same faint shimmer on their optical feeds, the same sensor distortions, the overexposure blooms during each microburst. Then HPU forced a new override packet onto the network. This one malformed, corrupted, data fields glitching in and out, timestamps overlapping, fragments of multiple protocols stitched together like a system dying under its own weight. And the few readable lines made no sense. Suspend coord, do not broad, main te, lock inte. And then the final packet arrived in a burst of corrupted pixels that made the console flicker violently. But the message was unmistakable. All arrays report synchronous behavior from 3I ATLS signal source. And Maya staggered back a step, pressing her hand to her mouth as if the words had hit her physically. The next moment, the waterfall flared white-hot, the bottom half of the plot saturating into a dense wall of intensity, as the upper half fizzed with narrow, needle-like spikes that appeared and vanished too fast to track. And then the entire band collapsed inward like a folding accordion, squeezing itself into a single, ultra-thin line again. But this time, the line oscillated with an almost musical regularity, amplitude rising and falling in a clean, sinusoidal arc that reminded Dan of test tones used in lab calibration. Except no natural astrophysical source produced tones this pure, this stable, and certainly not modulated. Outside, the dishes shuddered once more, the motors whining under strain as the array aligned even more tightly, so precisely that the tracking lines overlapped into a single mathematical curve. No jitter, no noise, no error bars. And then the temperature inside the control room began to rise as the boards heated again, the smell of warmed circuitry filling the air. But neither of them moved because the screens were shifting once more, the razor line flattening into a dead horizontal, as if the entire electromagnetic signature had gone silent, and the speakers cut to absolute zero, not static, not hum, but pure void, a hole where sound should have been. And for 2 long seconds the silence pressed so hard against their skulls that Dan thought he was going deaf. But then a deep vibration rippled through the floor, shaking dust from the ceiling tiles, and the line in the waterfall surged back to life, rising, 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 until it reached full-scale saturation. And as the system strained under the load, the lights flickered in a slow, rolling strobe. The external cameras washed into overexposed white, and the dishes outside pivoted into their tightest formation yet, every surface angled in mirror geometry, as though bracing for some incoming shock. And in that breathless moment before the next surge rolled through, Dan caught Maya's eyes, both of them frozen in the same realization. Not spoken, not theorized, but felt in the gut. That whatever was happening to their systems, whatever was reaching through the equipment, whatever was forcing global synchronization across continents, it was building towards something, and they were far past the point of stopping it.
The moment the line on the waterfall bent upward in that smooth, impossible arc,
Everything in the control room seemed to shrink into a tighter, more pressurized silence, as if the very air were waiting for something to break. And Dan remained locked in place, fingers hovering over frozen controls, while Maya's breath hitched in a thin, whispered gasp beside him, as the displays began to re-render the signal into a new configuration none of the standard tools recognized, the software stripping away every familiar visual cue until only a single pulsing band remained, bright enough to wash faint reflections across their cheeks. Outside, the synchronized shutter of the 30 dishes rose into a harsh, metallic resonance, each structure groaning at a slightly different pitch, so that together they formed a vibrating, bone-deep chord that rolled through the building as though some immense force had gripped the entire array and was forcing it into alignment with a precision no mechanical limit could justify. And Dan felt his ribs tingling with the vibration even before the next shift arrived, a sudden power sag that made the overhead lights dim into a sickly amber glow as the backup systems kicked in, not smoothly as before, but in a stumbling cascade of delayed relays, each one clicking with a small, sharp, metallic crack that reminded him of electrical arcs in failing circuitry. The displays flickered with short bursts of pixel distortion, the once stable interface blinking into a bare-bones diagnostic shell that displayed only raw signal amplitude, antenna angle, and the fault logs that scrolled so fast they became a gray blur of warnings. And Dan's heart hammered with a heavy, adrenaline-pumping certainty that whatever the signal was doing now, whatever state 3i ATLS had entered, it was beyond the capacity of their instruments to interpret, let alone withstand. The mapped audio output, previously a thin, pressure-like tone, now thickened into a quivering, low-frequency pulse that trembled through the speakers without producing any real sound, more like a physical sensation vibrating the air between molecules, crawling along the metal housings of the consoles and rising up through the soles of their shoes into the hollow of their bones. And Maya pressed her palms against the edges of her monitor, as if bracing herself against an unseen current pushing through the room. The waterfall brightened again, its single razor-thin line oscillating with a sharp periodicity, amplitude rising and falling with mechanical perfection, like a calibration waveform synthesized in a controlled lab environment, rather than anything pulled from deep space. And that perfection scared Dan more than the chaos that came before, because there was no randomness left in the line, nothing natural, nothing noisy, nothing to latch onto as familiar, just a pure, unwavering modulation with an impossibly stable rise time that held for a full 4 seconds before collapsing into a thin, rapid tremor that shook the entire vertical axis of the plot. Outside, the desert wind began to rise, stirring dust across the concrete pads around the array, but the air above the dishes shimmered with a faint, wavering distortion that made the stars ripple like heat rising from an engine. And when the external camera tried to compensate, the frame smeared into horizontal bands of overexposure, the senses nearly blinded by the impossible brightness centered on the dish alignment, as though 3i ATLS itself were projecting some kind of glare the optics couldn't parse, even though the object was millions of miles away and should have been no more than a faint speck.
Maya rewound the last 2 seconds of the optical buffer, but the camera refused playback, frozen in a hard lock, the frame counters stuck on a timestamp that flickered back and forth between 2 values, wobbling like a glitching metronome. And when she checked the internal clock against the atomic reference, she saw it had drifted again, more than 9 microseconds this time, jumping, stuttering, then realigning in discrete, repeating steps that didn't match any known failure mode. The servers behind them began to hiss as fans ramped to maximum, airflow roaring hot against the walls of the racks, and multiple thermal alerts appeared along the right keyline of the interface, red triangles flashing insistently, even as the system suppressed most of the warnings under the remote override that now seemed to be issuing commands faster than the hardware could process them. And Dan watched in a kind of disbelieving horror as the status indicators for every receiver abruptly switched into remote mode, denying manual control entirely, even though no human authority had been given clearance to seize all channels simultaneously. The next surge hit like a physical blow, lights dimming to a single thin bar of white along the ceiling fixtures, the antenna motors howling as they made yet another coordinated snap turn that sent a ripple of dust swirling across the cameras, and the signal amplitude skyrocketed so fast the plot clipped into a solid, burning column of intensity for an entire second before dropping back into an unnervingly flat plateau that stretched across the full width of the waterfall like a horizon line, neither changing nor decaying, just existing with static, impossible steadiness. Dan swallowed, throat dry, and tried to check the dish telemetry, but the system refused to load the orientation graph, replacing it with a blinking symbol indicating unknown mode, something he had never seen before and could not find in any documentation. And when Maya attempted to access the maintenance logs, they were greeted with a flood of corrupted entries. Thousands of lines of null, broken timestamps, and repeating blocks of identical digits that made no mathematical sense, as though the internal record-keeping had been overwritten by some looping, deafening stream of input that erased everything except the fragments whose patterns somehow fit whatever the array was now trying to obey. The mapped audio rose again, not in volume, but in pressure, vibrating at a frequency that made the edges of Dan's vision fuzz slightly at the corners, as though the pitches were riding along the nerves rather than the ears, and he pressed a hand against the desk to steady himself as a strange sensation of vertigo washed over him, not dizziness, but a subtle lurch, as if the room's gravity had tilted half a degree off-center. Maya braced herself against the server rack, shoulders tense, and forced her eyes back to the main data display as the plateau on the waterfall began to ripple, tiny fluctuations racing along its length like thin waves on the surface of a perfectly calm sea, each ripple evenly spaced, growing sharper, more defined, more structured with every passing second. The ripples sharpened until each one became a crisp vertical spike, evenly spaced down the line, forming a ladder-like pattern that marched with steady purpose across the plot. And with each appearing spike, the mapped audio translated the change into a faint metallic flutter, like the ghost of a gear clicking into place somewhere behind the walls, gaining clarity as the sequence progressed. Outside, the dishes creaked again, this time not in a sudden synchronized jolt, but in a slow, deliberate glide, each one rotating a fraction of a degree at the same precise moment so that the entire array moved like a set of giant mechanical pedals opening toward some invisible source in the night sky, and Dan felt the hair on his arms stand on end at the sight, not because the motion was abrupt, but because it was too smooth, too controlled, too utterly beyond the range of their normal guiding software, as though the system had resolved its earlier instability and had now entered a mode of terrifying precision. The external logs flickered and vanished, replaced with a single line of gray text that refused to clear no matter how many times he hit the override. Telemetry disabled, receiving direct input, and the lack of any identifiable sender on that line made his stomach twist with cold, creeping dread because nothing in their network architecture allowed for direct input without a known origin. And yet here the system was, calmly insisting it was no longer theirs. Then a low-frequency rumble vibrated through the floor again, deeper and more resonant than before, and Maya's fingers curled against the lip of the console as a set of new spikes erupted across the waterfall, their amplitude higher and more uniform than anything they had yet captured, forming a grid of evenly spaced energy bursts that grew brighter and sharper with each cycle, until the grid resembled a mesh of perfect Euclidean lines carved through the noise, something so mathematically clean that it made Dan's chest constrict as the realization settled over him that they were witnessing a process beyond any astrophysical phenomenon he had ever studied, something guided not by chance or natural emission, but by an underlying structure or mechanism seeking some unreachable equilibrium. The mapped audio now oscillated between two tones, one deep and rumbling, the other sharp and piercing, alternating with disorienting regularity that made the room feel like a physical chamber being tuned by unseen hands. And Dan's eyes began to water as the pitch of the higher tones scraped at the inner edges of his hearing, the sensation less painful than uncanny, as though his brain could not decide whether the sound existed externally or somewhere beneath his thoughts, a phantom echo vibrating through bone instead of air. Maya's shoulders tightened visibly, her pulse beating rapid beneath the skin of her neck as she stared at the screen and whispered almost involuntarily, "It's calibrating." And though the words slipped out before she could catch it, Dan didn't correct her or dismiss the idea, because even if they couldn't name what they were seeing, the pattern felt undeniably deliberate, too clean, too symmetrical, too focused, and the array outside responded in perfect synchrony, the dishes tilting with minuscule corrections that carved faint arcs against the sky, mechanical limbs adjusting to input neither of them triggered. The global observatory channel crackled to life once more, but this time the incoming packets were severely delayed, arriving in jittery bursts that overlapped and corrupted each other. Yet through the noise, Dan could make out key fragments. Australia, all dishes in lock mode, no response from local controls. Chile, unknown frequency shift, system overriding all safety limits. South Africa, receivers heating, gain unalterable, signal cleaning itself. There was no instruction from HQ now, no clarifying directive, no emergency procedure, only silence from the one place that should have been screaming orders at them. And that lack of guidance pressed heavier on Dan's chest than any warning would have, because it meant the upper command channels were either overwhelmed or disconnected, leaving them stranded at the edge of whatever threshold the system was crossing. Then the plateau on the waterfall fractured next, splitting into two diverging lines that arced away from each other with impossible symmetry, and the mapped audio generated a low harmonic that sent faint tremors through his molars, making him wince and grip the side of the console harder as the two arcs widened, brightened, then snapped back to a single, blinding frequency that burned a temporary after-image onto the center of his vision, a ghostly band of white-blue light that hovered like a vertical scar even when he blinked. Maya stumbled backward at the flash, hand flying to her forehead, and the overhead heads pulsed, once, twice, 3 times, in perfect step with the final convergence of the arcs, the room flickering with a cold, sterile brilliance that illuminated every shadow into stark geometric angles. When Dan looked back at the main display, the waterfall was no longer a waterfall at all, but a single plane of shifting intensity, a two-dimensional field of pulsing brightness that expanded and contracted like a living sheet of light, responding instantly to some unseen modulation, as though the signal had outgrown the old graphing model and forced the system to invent a new visualization to contain it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them broken only by the faint strain of metal outside, as the array's structural beams flexed under the asymmetrical load of the continuous micro-corrections, the dishes shifting so subtly yet so incessantly that Dan wondered how much more strain the mechanical joints could take before something snapped. And as if answering that fear, the thermal gauges on the left monitor surged again, flashing crimson on every receiver simultaneously, heat rising in rhythmic pulses that matched the brightness waves across the new display. Maya tried to override the cooling systems manually, but the interface rejected every command, redirecting her to a blank page that flickered once and then vanished, as if mocking the idea that they still held any authority over the machinery humming dangerously around them.
The mapped audio deepened to a bone-vibrating drone, steady and suffocating,
a slow modulation that pressed against the walls like a shifting atmospheric pressure front. And Dan felt his heartbeat sink for a moment with the rhythm before he caught himself and forced a breath, grounding his focus on the single remaining panel that hadn't been overridden, the outdated, low-resolution seismic monitor that still tracked micro-vibrations in the array structure. And to his horror, it showed rising, patterned tremors, repeating shapes like fingerprints etched into the mechanical noise, cycles of movement so precise they resembled encoded pulses. Except nothing was supposed to be encoding anything. Not here, not now, not through metal and ground. Then a sudden brightness tore across the external feed, the cameras flaring into a solid white sheet that washed out every contour of the night. And though the feed was obviously overloaded, the interference carried a strange vertical banding that repeated at exact intervals, too structured for random sensor failure. And at the center of the whiteness, a faint vertical streak glowed, hotter, brighter, sharper than anything else, a narrow spear of illumination rising from the alignment of the dishes like a spotlight shining backward into the camera. And Maya's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the impossible glare, unable to tell whether it was an artifact or something manifesting physically above the array. The waterfall plane pulsed faster now, the brightness waves compressing into tighter intervals that flickered with an urgent, accelerating cadence. And Dan felt the edge of panic scratching up his spine as he realized the pulses were counting down, each brighter pulse arriving sooner, stronger, more synchronized with the shifting drone in the speakers, as if everything in the room, every system, every dish, every sensor, every calculation had been drawn into a single convergent process building toward a point he could feel but not understand. The countdown sensation tightened with every pulse, each contraction of brightness drawing the room into a narrower, more breathless state, until the very air seemed to strain under the accelerating rhythm, and Dan felt a hollow pressure row beneath his sternum as though some unseen hand were winding an invisible gear deeper and deeper inside his chest. Maya pressed her back against the server rack, the glow of the screens flickering across her face in frantic, strobing intervals as the mapped audio thickened into a layered vibration that didn't feel like one tone anymore, but many, stacked, intertwining, folding into each other like standing waves colliding in a sealed chamber, building toward some perfect destructive harmony. Outside, the array's final correction came with a sound so deep and resonant it shook dust from the ceiling vents, the 30 dishes locking into an alignment so unnaturally perfect that even through the distorted camera feed, Dan could see the silhouette edges overlap in impossible geometric symmetry, a single enormous shape rather than 30 separate machines, unified under a control neither he nor Maya possessed. And even as panic clawed at the back of his throat, he found himself frozen by the sheer magnitude of the sight, unable to look away from the precision of the alignment as the external feed quivered under the strain of the white-hot vertical streak blooming at the center. The intensity on the waterfall plane surged into a rolling wave that rippled outward in expanding rings of brightness, each ring sharper, more defined, more mercilessly symmetrical than the last, until the entire display became a throbbing map of convergent geometry, a visual language too exact to be noise, too structured to be random, too controlled to belong to anything their systems were designed to interpret. And Maya staggered forward, gripping the back of Dan's chair with trembling fingers as the next wave crashed across the screen and the mapped audio shuddered into a multi-layered harmonic so strong that the metal floor panels vibrated in sync, humming beneath their feet with the sharp rattle of stressed bolts and overstrained drives. The temperature in the room shot upward in a single, unified spike, heat radiating from every panel as the receiver boards fought to remain operational under the deluge of input, morning lights flashing red across the racks like a constellation of tiny alarms. But neither of them could tear their eyes from the display as the pulse rhythm accelerated into a near-constant shimmering flicker, the brightness on the plane becoming almost continuous, the transitions so fast that they blurred into a luminous haze, broken only by moments of razor-clear intensity that stabbed into their eyes like needles. The building hummed louder and louder, the structural beams resonating under the synchronized vibration coming from the array outside, and Dan had to steady himself against the console when a distant metallic crack echoed through the walls. Something large, something heavy, something mechanical, giving way under stress. But the array kept moving, kept adjusting, kept aligning as though fractures and strain were irrelevant to the process now unfolding. The global observatory channel blinked once more before freezing entirely, the incoming packets dissolving into corrupted static that flickered for a heartbeat and then vanished, the connection severed, as though the network itself had collapsed under the load or been deliberately cut. And a cold realization washed through Dan that they might be completely isolated now, locked in a closed loop with something too vast to comprehend. Then, with a suddenness that made both of them flinch, the mapped audio cut out, gone in an instant,
replaced by a suffocating silence that knocked the breath from Dan's lungs. A silence so total it felt like the world had been sealed behind soundproof glass. Even the rumble of the servers and the groan of the array outside seemingly muted beneath the crushing quiet. The waterfall plane froze next, brightness locking into a single smooth sheet of white that covered the entire display from top to bottom. A wall of light so solid and uniform it had no texture, no variation, no identifiable features, just a blinding blankness that defied analysis or interpretation. And for a moment Dan wondered if the system had finally died, if the hardware had collapsed under the impossible strain and given up. But then the white shifted, dimming slightly around the edges as though retreating inward, concentrating itself into a tighter, more compact core. The external feed flickered back on just long enough to show the full array, every dish tilted at the exact same angle, every surface catching the faint desert starlight as a ghostly shimmer rippled through the sky above them, distorting the horizon into a wavering line as if the air itself were flexing under the pressure of an unseen force. And then the image collapsed into pixelated fragmentation, dissolving into a grid of black and white squares before the entire feed went dark. The lights overhead flickered, sputtered, then steadied into a dim, trembling glow as the white core at the center of the waterfall plane contracted into a thin vertical line. Thin as a wire, bright as a welder's arc, its intensity so concentrated it seemed to burn through the display. A luminous blade, hovering in the center of the screen with a presence that made Dan's pulse throb in his temples. Maya took a single step backward, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Dan." But whatever fear or question she intended to voice was swallowed by the sudden, violent jolt that rocked the room as the line brightened and expanded outward again. Not slowly this time, but in a rapid, explosive burst that washed across the display in a blinding shockwave of light. The mapped audio roaring back in a single deafening burst of low-frequency pressure that slammed into their chests like a physical blow. The consoles flickered, the power surged, and the entire room was filled with a blinding brilliance that stabbed into their eyes, forcing them to shield their faces as the final waveform rippled across every display in a fractal burst of impossible symmetry. The pattern so perfect, so absolute, so meticulously structured that it carved itself into Dan's vision as the screens went dark. An imprint of order so unnervingly complete it felt like a message without words, a conclusion without explanation, a result without context. And then, as abruptly as the surge began, everything stopped. The mapped audio cut to silence, the external motors halted mid-strain, the lights steadied, the temperature dropped in a sharp, chilling wave, and one by one the consoles rebooted into a dead calm, the system restoring itself to baseline as if waking from a seizure, the waterfall returning to a faint drizzle of ordinary cosmic background noise, the array outside falling into stillness under the quiet desert sky. For a long time Dan didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak, neither did Maya. As the last afterimage of that perfect fractal pulse faded from his retinas and the realization sank into the hollow center of his chest that whatever 3I-ATLAS had just done, whatever process it had completed, whatever convergence they had witnessed, it was over now, finished, done with them. And the screens reflected only the quiet, indifferent noise of a universe that had already moved on. And in that cold, empty stillness, with the dishes outside frozen like monuments and the equipment humming weakly back to life, a single final line appeared at the bottom of the rebooting main console. Not a command, not a warning, not a word. Just a timestamp marked a fraction of a microsecond after the fractal pulse ended, as though some part of the system had registered one last signal that neither of them had the tools to decipher. A silent marker of completion that made Dan's breath hitch as he leaned closer, reading the only thing the array had left behind.